For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding Podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media with your friends, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Humans evolved in social cooperative bands, using this cooperation as an evolutionary advantage. These days, rugged individualism still seems to dominate many outdoor activities, from regular camping to bushcraft and even to rewilding. When people think of ancestral skills, they often think of handcrafts like basket weaving, pottery, or archery, and not the invisible social technologies like conflict resolution, mentoring, or practices of sharing. This is a challenge that many practitioners and leaders of schools and other community organizations often come across. If rewilding is returning to our human roots, then community building works as the primary ancestral skill. Everything else stems from this. Today, to talk with me about this is Luke McLaughlin. Luke is the founder and director of Holistic Survival School in North Carolina. His work centers around connecting people to the natural world through ancestral living skills to help remember how humans lived in balance with their environments in times past. He learned his skills working at a wilderness therapy program in the deserts of Utah. After spending hundreds of hours on the trail and helping hundreds of people, he witnessed firsthand how important these skills are for life lessons and personal growth. He's demonstrated these skills on the Discovery Channel's show Naked and Afraid and their offshoots, Naked and Afraid XL and Naked and Afraid Alone. Luke's main focus is making deep connections and providing a life-changing experience through the Deep Remembering Immersion program at his school. Luke, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Peter, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So I kind of want to just start out with like your origin story. I'm very interested in the wilderness therapy side of things. I've met lots of people who've done that in the past, and I'm curious, how did you get into that? And, was that your introduction to primitive skills, or were you interested in that stuff beforehand?
I was not interested in that stuff beforehand. I actually have this pretty funny memory of being in Ohio at Dave Canterbury's Pathfinder gathering, and my brother, who was a naturopath and an herbalist, was teaching there, teaching plants, and I was in grad school, and I brought all my college books with me. And my brother brought me along. He's like, "Oh, this will be fun. Come on, we'll go learn some skills," And I remember just being like, what is the point of flint knapping? Like, this is so stupid. What is the point of making fire with sticks? This is so dumb. So I was like 24 then and was studying evolutionary biology in grad school and was just like, this is pointless. I don't get it. Long story short, I ended up not being in grad school for very long. And I was in education originally. And so being in education, being in public school, I always wanted to mentor young adults. I had a lot of good coaches and a lot of good teachers in my life as a kid. And so I really wanted to pay that back. But in my short stint in education, I saw how inept the system was at actually meeting these kids for where they were at. My job as a biology teacher was to teach them about ribosomes and mitochondria and all these things that are maybe applicable to our everyday life. And they would come to me with really heavy issues like, my dad hit me last night and my 14-year-old girlfriend is pregnant. And, and I'd be like, whoa, like, okay, let's talk about that. And I almost, could have lost my job if I were to engage in that kind of connection with them. Right. Even though they had trusted me and had built a relationship, I had to legally send them to the school counselor, which was just ridiculous.
Yeah.
The kids didn't know how to eat proper nutritional food and all these issues. So anyway, I said, there's got to be a better way to reach the kids and to help. And so I went to grad school for a short while, but then I got eventually found a job in Utah working in wilderness therapy. And that's where all my like loves kind of connected.
Mm.
I grew up hunting and fishing and being an outdoors kid in Michigan, and found wilderness therapy, which not only let me be outside, let me be in my body, do hard hikes, but I also got to mentor these kids and got to mentor them in this way that actually resonated with them and talk about the things that were actually going on in their life. And the program I happened to find a job at happened to be, based on primitive skills or ancestral skills. Um, so everything we were doing, everything we were teaching the kids, was okay. You want to use the fire to cook tonight? Well, you got to make your own fire with sticks. Our own backpacks were made out of, juniper from the desert around us. We were making moccasins. We were making our own spoons and bowls and stuff. And so it was pretty, one of the more hardcore programs. We didn't do like adventure rope climbing stuff, but instead we learned these skills.
Totally.
And that's where I just fell in love with it. I was just like so on fire for the work and loved watching people change and grow in a matter of days.
Mm.
Yeah, so that was like 12 years ago, a little over 12 years ago now. So since then, I've just been like, okay, like the rest of my life. And I actually, like a few months in, dedicated my life to this work. It's just like, this is what I do the rest of my life. So,
Yeah. Side note, I was recently looking up information about Larry Dean Olson, who was the founder of Boulder Outdoor Survival School. But also I found out that he was actually kind of the inspiration for bringing ancestral skills into wilderness therapy. So it's interesting that you went to this school in Utah, or the therapy program in Utah, because anyway, I just think about how much influence that guy has had. He's kind of like, he didn't write a lot of books other than Outdoor Survival School or Outdoor Survival Skills. And I think that, there's other people out there that have made a huge impact as well, that have written lots of books around things. But I feel like he was sort of such a subtle influence that not a lot of people realize how much of an influence he had. So I'm just like, I'm
totally
fascinated by that.
Yeah, isn't it amazing how one person can impact so many people,
Totally. Yeah.
Whether, whatever about the person. I'm thinking of Tom Brown Jr. right now too. Just like
Right,
whatever
exactly.
you want to say
Yeah.
about him, left or right, like this or that.
Yeah.
Wow, what an impact,
Yeah.
these people have had.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Cool. So I'm kind of like working through your sort of trajectory, right? So then after that, did you do Naked and Afraid before you started Holistic Survival?
Yeah, I guess I did do Naked and Afraid. Yeah. So the first Naked and Afraid I did, my godparents, I didn't have a TV or anything like that. My godparents at the time were just like, hey, check out this show, like it's what you do in the woods, we think it's what you do.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was like really early on. It was the first season or maybe second season at most. And there was a lot of like ex-military guys
Mhm.
who were quite
Mhm.
misogynistic and
Mhm.
just pretty gnarly, or at least
Yep.
heavily edited that way.
Right.
And I was just like, I remember watching it and being like, I could do that without like being an asshole, let's give it a
Yeah.
try. And
Right.
so I kind of just filled out an application online and just as a joke. And they were like, cool. Yeah. And they were really excited about the skills. And looking back now, I'm like, oh my God, like I had no idea what I was doing, because I had camped in Utah and learned some primitive skills here and there. I'm just like, yeah, let's go for it. Let's go to Africa and survive for 21 days. And yeah, so I just kind of went for it,
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
naive.
So for those who don't know, I mean, I just assume that most of my listeners know what Naked and Afraid is, but for those who don't know, Naked and Afraid is a television show on Discovery Channel where two people are dropped somewhere in the world. They have to strip off their clothes naked. They're strangers. It's a man and a woman, and they have to live for 21 days in the wilderness. They get one item. Usually it's like a fire starter or a knife. They get one item each. And then they have to use that to basically exist. And there's usually a point towards the end where they have to make their way to an extraction point. And so it's very taxing. It's very on the body, obviously, for 21 days. You're exposed to the elements. There's insects. There's sun exposure. There's all kinds of cold, wet, dry, hot, all the things. It's similar to another show, Alone, in a lot of ways, or maybe even like Dual Survivor. There's a few other shows like that. But Naked and Afraid is very unique in its setup. in that you have a companion, you have nothing but one item, and you have to make it for 21 days. So you said that you feel like you didn't really know a lot. I mean, I've been doing this shit since I was like fucking a teenager, and I watched that show and I'm like, I don't know if I could do this, which is why I don't think I've ever done it. I mean, and I always had that sort of like, I don't know if it's a lack of confidence or like an over, or just fear, of like
Uh,
actually challenging myself in particular ways. And I think, I did Boss's Boulder Outdoor Survival School's 14-day field course, and then I did their hunter-gatherer course, which is essentially, it's not too dissimilar in a lot of ways. It's definitely not as hardcore. It's the hunter-gatherer is 14 days, and you're with a group of people, but you're essentially, you have minimal gear, you have clothes, but you don't have a sleeping bag. We didn't have water bottles. We had like a gourd bowl, different things like that. And that challenge for me was really fun, and it left me hungry for more. And now I'm kind of like, that was the hardest thing I knew that I could do that exists, except doing one of these shows. So now I'm kind of like,
yeah.
is Naked and Afraid my next step? I don't know.
Oh, they would
But
love you. They would eat you
I'm
up.
sure.
I'm sure they've been knocking at your door for years, probably.
Yeah, Rewild Portland gets lots of inquiries for shows and stuff like that. But
Uh,
yeah, so I mean, as somebody, I mean, you obviously you made it. Spoiler alert,
I
Luke
didn't
made
die.
it the 21 days with a partner. It's a really good episode. It was one of the first ones I ever watched, actually, because I knew you, and I watched it years ago, and I'm rewatching all of them right now, or I'm going through and watching all of them right now. But
Wow.
um, and yeah, so I mean, what do you wish you would have known going in? I mean, you made it all 21 days. So you're saying like, oh, I didn't realize how I didn't have the skills in reflection, but like you
Yeah,
did because you made it all the way through.
totally.
So
Yeah.
so I mean, what's the what do you wish you had known or something along those lines in that kind of
Yeah.
scenario?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't, I'm happy with how it turned out and it was great. And I knew enough to play, and that was really what it was. It was just like, let's play,
Yeah,
but looking back, it was just like, I mean, the first few days, it's kind of, the main survival thing is like, okay, well, thermal regulation, right? Can you
totally.
shelter? Can
Yeah.
you make a fire? And can you build a fire so you can boil water so you can then regulate your body temperature, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
the first couple days of
Totally.
survival, that's all it is. And
Hmm.
so once, and that took me a while to get there. And, I was in Namibia in the high desert. And so every night it was like in the 40s or something crazy. And I was just like the most miserable
Yeah.
night I've ever had
Yeah.
in my life.
Yeah.
So, and I was coming in like fire was my thing,
Yeah, totally.
confident. And
Yeah.
that's not to say that I wasn't, like I did know a lot then and I did practice all the time. But you go to a new landscape
Right.
and I think that's the naivete that I couldn't have prepared
Mm,
for
mm,
is how ecocentric, how location centric all of the skills are,
totally.
and particularly the ones that I found really challenging that I had really no experience in were pretty much, like food,
Mm, mm.
small traps and snares. I knew enough growing up in Michigan that like easy food is by water, so I went to the swamps and I caught frogs and snakes and all these things that kind of like keep me going. But yeah, that's the thing that I think is hardest to translate when people are like, I still have a thing about snares and like, where people teach me how to do a figure four. I'm like, do you know how specific snares are in indigenous cultures where it's like it's this week in this month and we're using
Mm,
this seed that is happening from this plant and we're
mm.
capturing this bird with this snare and this location. And so I kind of like not poo poo the whole thing. I know it works, but my lack of knowledge of deep, deep,
Mm,
intimacy with the land feels so shallow that I'm like, I don't know how to do that. Like, nor do I know the lineage of this
totally.
landscape,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Namibia, how to
Right.
do.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I don't know if I had done everything any differently, but it would have been nice to, I mean, yeah, I'm just like, there was a whole dead animal that I was like, oh my God, I didn't do any bone tools. Like there was a
Oh,
whole
right. Yeah.
kiss. I was like, oh my God, there's so many resources
Yeah.
there. Could have made a gnat ladle or, and
Mm,
throwing tools and
mm.
needles and all sorts of fun stuff.
I
So
mean, do you feel like you were in it? I mean, even if you had the knowledge that you have going back now, do you think you would have done a lot more of those things, even like when starvation is kicking in and you're kind of like tired or,
uh,
like I mean, I feel like that's my thing is I'm not good at acquiring protein. That's like the biggest
Uh,
gap in my knowledge is hunting
yeah,
and gathering. And so for me, I'm always like, shit, you know, how if I was trying to do those, I would have to just be like losing a lot of weight and relying
yeah.
on fat stores. Um, but also there's this thing of like, how much energy do you want to expend to do a
Hmm.
lot more things if it's going to cost you those calories to do that
Hmm.
kind of a thing?
Hmm. Totally. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think for me personally, one of the hardest parts is the lack of mission. If I don't have a mission in
Mm,
those
yeah,
days, I
yeah.
just feel absolutely horrible.
Mm,
Like you
mm,
focus on the hunger and then you focus on the
mm.
boredom,
Right.
or I do, and I just feel
Sure.
like crap, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so in my 21 days I did alone, I was laughing at how I hunted a couple impala, ended up killing a couple animals, and then had all this meat to process for a few days, and then I had a week to kill. And I had all the meat in the world. And I was like, oh my
Oh
God, this is
no.
my nightmare. Like I'm
Yeah,
just
right.
sitting there. And so I was
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm going to go hunt. I can't do this. So I was like, I'm just going to
Yeah.
hunt again because I'm in
Yeah.
Africa. Why not?
Yeah.
And then I'd go stand in a tree for 8 hours a day. And I was having so much fun.
Yeah.
It's like I went from standing on the ground for 8 hours and being bored and miserable, or standing in a tree for 8 hours and
Totally.
hunting.
Yeah.
And I was so
Amazing.
happy. And
Yeah.
so just that psychological switch of what it did
Mm,
for me, oh,
mm.
I would have made. And that's what I think of when I think of Namibia, is just like the boredom and just not
Yeah.
knowing what to do, and then
Yeah.
getting in your head and questioning, oh, I wish I had more skills and I should be doing this.
Mm.
While if I had like a bone tool to make, I'm just grinding a
Right.
bone
Yeah.
on a rock for
Yeah.
8 hours.
Something
I
to
don't have to think
do.
about it. Yeah, it's
Right.
something.
Yeah. No, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
But
yeah,
I think,
then
oh yeah.
go, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, you were saying how the protein gathering is a hard part for you, and that's something I've hunting and making bows and atlatls and that kind of stuff has been a big passion of mine. And going into that scenario, once again, not knowing the landscape, not knowing the patterns, not knowing the animals, and then doing it with like maybe one other person is just like absolutely bonkers.
Yeah. Right.
I often say like Naked and Afraid was the most human thing I've ever done and the least human thing I've ever.
Yeah.
That like
Amazing.
no one in the history of the world would ever just be dropped into a new location with no resources, no like, ancestral teaching of how to live in these ways, and then just do it by yourself. Or at least I
Totally.
can't think of an
Yeah.
example of why a human
Yeah.
would be in that situation. So it's just like completely modern, made up bonkers thing.
Yeah. I think there's like the only thing I would compare it to is maybe like a rite of passage where I've heard of different, indigenous societies where the individual has to go out and do survival stuff, which is like it's a rite of passage. It's something that they do as a teenager after spending 15 years learning all of this stuff.
Right.
And then they're
Watching.
held by a container and they go out into an environment that they maybe probably know, even if they're out there by themselves. It's relatively
Mhm.
similar to where they grew up or whatever. So yeah,
Totally.
it's nothing even like that really, but it's the closest thing I could imagine
Yeah.
as some sort of rite of passage, but
No, that's really
yeah,
close. I think, and that's kind of how it feels in my life. Before I got into rites of passage work, which I do now, that was my biggest rite of passage. People would be
totally.
like, what was your rite of passage? And I'm like, probably starving in Africa and figuring shit out.
Yeah. Amazing.
So
Uh,
TV ended up being my like cultural rite of passage. Like
right. Yeah, I
what
know.
an
It's so
irony.
mind-blowing. I
Yeah,
know.
what a funny thing.
And it's cool. I mean, it's really cool too that it is on TV, that it is there for people to sort of observe. And that's there's a whole other avenue of conversation I would love to have at some point of just kind of like, how they portray people. And I guess I'll just ask that before we move on. I'm curious, like, did you have
Mhm.
fears of how they were going to portray you going into it? Because like you were
Oh
said a
God.
minute ago, a lot of they portrayed a lot of the men as these sort of like dickish, ex-military dudes or whatever. And so, yeah, what was your thoughts on going into that? And then how did you feel they portrayed you after the fact?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was terrified. I was terrified
Yeah,
of giving them any ammo to
right.
change any story. And when I've
Yeah,
talked to the producers who are my friends
sure.
now,
Yeah,
but you talk to them and they're like, well, listen, we have 40 minutes to tell, 400 hours or whatever, how many hours it is of a story. It's like we could tell 40 different stories if we wanted to. And
right.
so it is kind of a trip to, to know that it's still entertainment and they're telling a
Yeah.
certain story. And a lot of times what I've noticed is just like they're they're playing you as a character and like so what you look like, they're like, oh well, Luke looks like a hero or a macho man. And so they're gonna play it that way.
Right.
Or I look like a hippie, so they're gonna play it
Sure.
that
Yeah,
way,
yeah. Okay.
Um, and I get it, but it's
Yeah,
also
yeah.
taking a human experience and a beautiful human experience and a rite of passage in many
Yeah,
ways
yeah.
and condensing it down to this cartoon
Totally.
caricature of what
Yeah.
actually happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a whole trip
Interesting.
there for sure.
Yeah.
So I was definitely
Yeah.
had fear and was kind of like very choosy with my words.
Hmm.
Um,
Is there
and
anything that you said that you were like, shit, I shouldn't have said that?
oh, I'm sure there
That
was.
ended up in the show and you were like, damn it, they ended up putting that in.
Oh yeah, I mean, and the 40-day
Yeah.
one that we did
Mm.
in Colombia, that was with 11 other people, and they played up this difference. We had two different groups of humans, and one was tended to be more ex-military, kind of screaming,
Mm.
yelling, tough guys, and the other group was kind of like the hippie group.
Okay.
And
Right.
it was dry season, Colombia, no rain, almost the whole 40 days. We had like a few hours of rain, and we were just like, they're like, "Aren't you going to build a shelter?" And we were like, "For what?"
Right.
Like
Yeah.
85 degrees at night. There's no rain. Like
Wow.
a shelter keeps things in or keeps things out, and we don't have anything that we need to keep in or keep out.
Totally.
And,
Yeah.
and they were like, well, that's what survivalists do. And we were like, not necessarily. And so they played this whole montage of the military guys building this like sweet palace lifted off the ground. They cut down like 30 trees, they're working their asses off. And us hippies are just like lounge and like sleeping, these like lazy hippies not
Oh
doing any
my
work. So
God.
I said a whole bunch of stuff about, I don't know, chilling out and relaxing
Yeah.
and being one with nature and all this stuff, and they just ate that up. So,
Yeah.
you
Amazing.
know,
Wow.
yeah, yeah,
So yeah, what inspired you to start holistic survival and what is holistic survival?
yeah. Great question. Yeah, I mean, holistic survival school really started from the what I saw as the big duality in the nature connection survival school world, where there was kind of like how the TV portrayed our two camps. There's these two camps. There's nature connection schools, which are very, liberal minded and more relational and more hippie, if you will. And in these schools they're doing sit spots and they're singing to trees and they're doing rites of passage and very relational based, we could say. And that's so beautiful and so needed. And then the other side was the military side and the very like achieving, me versus nature. I'm going to set a goal. I'm going to, skills oriented, um, willpower driven. And that's beautiful and
Hmm.
needed too.
Hmm.
But they were just always so separate. And for me, it always felt so clear that they were one and the same, that these skills, and when you talk to, the Bushmen and the San people and indigenous cultures are like, well, it's the same thing,
Yeah.
like and this is our world, right? We take these innate human needs and divide them up as this or that. Pick which one. And I'm like, well, I want both. And
Hmm.
so starting holistic survival school, I was like, I don't want to use the word survival. I fucking hate the word survival.
What about
And one of my
survival? Sorry, I'm just kidding.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
kidding. I'm
totally. I hate
kidding.
that one too. And my one of my mentors was like, no, you need to use it. We need to re-own it, because it's not just about the survival of our physical bodies. It's about the survival of our spirit, the survival
Mm,
of our culture, the survival of our
mm,
planet, the survival of all these things that are actually dying. And so that kind of gets into what I view as my flavor of survival is much, much, much broader. And I always tell people, I'm like, what are the chances of you in North Carolina here dying from hypothermia or a bear or whatever? Pretty much zero, right? And there's a few things I'll teach you that you'll never ever be in
mm.
that situation, God
Yeah.
willing. But what's actually killing us? It's
Mm,
it's horrible foods that we're eating. It's a
mm,
lack of movement. It's a lack of community. It's a lack of
mm,
meaning. It's depression. It's
mm,
scrolling. It's a lack of culture. And so, with my evolutionary kind of viewpoint, with and influences like E.O. Wilson, who's like zooming out and seeing us as like a truly eusocial species, we start saying, oh, dancing, this thing that is beyond survival, right? It's not really survival. It's just a weird thing humans do. I'm like, no, actually, because it's so universal, it is a survival skill.
Mm-hmm.
It can shake out our trauma. It can unite us as a group. We can get out of our minds for a bit, like literally, out of our minds.
Mm-hmm.
So all these little things that are found throughout all human culture, all of a sudden, if we look at it with this kind of more zoomed out lens, we're saying, oh no, that actually is a survival skill. And because we're not dancing and because we're not singing and because we're not in community, we don't have mentors and rites of passage and all that beautiful village life, that's, in my opinion, actually the thing that's making us sick, both physically and mentally, is this gets to the old rewilding adage or story of like, yeah, a dog who's not allowed to do dog things gets physically and mentally sick. And you go to a zoo and you see, animals that are not getting their needs met socially, spiritually, whatever, they become sick. So holistic survival starts kind of questioning what actually is, where do we draw the line with survival, and what is actually the thing that we need to focus on? What's more important than hypothermia? Probably community.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you have this program called Deep Remembering Immersion.
Yeah.
That's kind of like I don't know, looking at the things and following you for as long as I have. It seems like that's sort of the magnum opus or like the big thing that you put most of your energy into.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like?
Yeah, so that's up to 18 people once a year signing up for doing the good work, doing the deep work. So it's often people who are in transition states in their life in some way. So maybe their kid graduated high school and they finally get to live for themselves. Maybe they're trying to change their job and are really miserable, wanting to do something differently. Something has come up where they want to shift their life. And so for 10 months, we meet for 4 days at a time. So from a Thursday to a Sunday, we meet in the woods and we learn skills. We learn, ancestral skills. And we also build community. So we work on like actually building a container to be real and authentic and speak about what it's like to live in this disconnected world that we live in. And yeah, we also do like kind of deep, I kind of combine it with, I have some history in learning like trauma informed therapy, breath work and somatics. And so we kind of add that in to make this burrito of like kind of healing. Because for many years I was just like, well, nature is healing, but like therapy is over here and they feel like totally different worlds. But as you'd imagine, when you get into nature, there's infinite fractals of what's happening in my inner realm is also happening on the outer realm in this outer landscape. And so using nature as a mirror for ourselves and vice versa. So yeah, we spend 40 days together in the woods, learning skills, a lot of playing, a lot of like inner child work and just playing games. Basically everything I offered to kids back in the
Mm,
day, I
mm,
offer to adults and they're
hmm
just like so stoked.
mm,
Um, but really, another way of saying it is like offering a new perspective. Deep remembering is offering a new perspective on everyday life. Like, how do we actually live a life that is connected to our landscape in reciprocity, and seasonally, and communally? And so, like-minded people coming together and like, oh, you want to learn this too. Oh, you felt disconnected in your life too. Cool. Like, let's connect through our disconnection. So yeah, so there's, and another way is like it's culture repair is another way of saying it.
hmm
Like we're naming all of the gaps that dominator culture has taken away from our lives, from almost everyone's life in this modern age. And saying, oh yeah, there used to be rites of passage, there used to be dancing, there used to be mentoring, there used to be regalia, there used to be ceremony. And we kind of do a little dabble in each one, but then invite people in to be like, I'm just one dude, like how can we together now build this up? So this is our 5th year. We're finishing up this year, and it keeps creating this greater community that's kind of weaving together every year, and it's really beautiful to watch. Yeah, alumni get together and yeah, just keep doing the work and to keep
Yeah.
trying to change this world little by little.
There's a couple of threads that you just made me think of. One is I like the word remembering, and I think it's probably, in context to two different sort of mentors that I've had, or not actual mentors, but inspirations, which was Daniel Quinn.
Mm,
He had this philosophy called the Great Forgetting, which was, how we all forgot what we were like to actual as living as humans, and that
mhm.
there needed to be a great remembering where we were coming back to those things. And so when I think of your program, that's like the first thing that pops into my head is that,
Yeah,
the great remembering and how important that is.
yeah,
And the word is just it's evocative, I think, of that stuff in a way that I don't find a lot of other words. So yeah, the verbiage that you've used, both the holistic survival as well as deep remembering, I feel like you've got like a thing dialed in there with some good language.
thanks. Appreciate it. As I appreciate your words and all the
Yeah.
words you've written. So that's high praise coming from you. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. The other question that made me think of is why North Carolina? I mean, and I'm asking this because, like, North Carolina, in my mind, I have FOMO because when I see all of the people that I know doing rewilding shit in North Carolina, I'm just like, fuck, that looks so fun and cool. And like, I'm stuck here in like urban Portland, and we just don't have access to a lot of the same things. And I feel like
Totally.
Portland is sort of this like urban mecca for rewilding, but North
Mm,
Carolina is this rural, like wild sort of mecca. And in part, Wild Roots Collective goes way back in the day in terms of rewilding there. But yeah, how did you end up in North Carolina? You were raised in Michigan, correct?
yep. Yep. Raised in
Yeah. What
Michigan.
was the inspiration to go to North Carolina?
Yeah. Well, so I was in Utah and then was like, all right, I'm going to move back to Michigan and do some community building there and buy some land with people and, have my school be based there. And I kind of went back and I was like, okay, everyone, let's do it, and everyone was like, oh, we're just talking. Like, we're not going to
Oh
like, I
no.
got a mortgage and I
Yeah.
got
Oh
kids and
no.
like,
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
oh crap, and kind of ran into that. And actually where I was at in Michigan, I was outside of Grand Rapids where I went to college. And to get to some, what I would call decently diverse woods, it was like a 45-minute drive for
Oh
me.
yeah.
And that wore on me real quick, coming from being out in Utah and being in BLM land. So yeah, so my partner at the time, she was a graduate of Warren Wilson College, which is a small, little, tiny liberal arts. Is it liberal arts or just super progressive college down here?
Yeah.
That farms, and every student has to be on the carpentry crew or on the herb
Mm.
crew, or it's pretty radical kind of school. And so she was graduate there, and she was like, for what you do and what you're into, we should just move to Asheville, and she's like, everyone's doing it there. And I'm like, all right, cool, let's check it
Yeah.
out. So I just kind of moved on a whim, and ended up not being with her, breaking up with her pretty quickly, but went to the first rendezvous down here. We
Mm.
have three skills rendezvous throughout the year, and got introduced to my now really close friends, and they're doing men's work and they're doing rites of passage and they have their own nature connection school. And I'm like, oh man, like it was easy for me to plug in to all these places. So, but I really missed the West, like I fell in love with Utah and missed the
Mm.
mountains, the landscape. I was just like, oh my God. But the thing that really sealed the deal for me was finding this kind of sub community outside of Asheville. You call it a rewilding community. There's a lot of permaculture going on, just alternative different ways.
Totally.
And there's like a lot of families here really going for it,
Yeah.
really like sticking to their ideals as best they can, and raising kids in a really beautiful way. And that's always been my goal,
Mm.
is to have a family and have kids. And so I always say if I was truly like choosing landscape based on what is best for me individually, I'd be out west. Like I'd be in the mountains,
Mm.
I'd be in the
Mm.
desert. There's something
Yeah,
special there for me.
Utah's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And if I'm truly not trying to be just an individual in this world, and raise kids and raise them in a good way and form community and not feel so alone, then Asheville is the place
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so I'm really happy with that choice, and it continues to grow all the good and the bad that comes with that. And but it's a really sweet sub community here for sure.
Yeah. Um, so I want to turn back towards this idea of community building as a fundamental survival skill.
Hmm.
And I'm curious, if you could talk a little bit and compare and contrast your experience on Naked and Afraid XL, which has more than just two people. You said it was 11,
Hmm.
with your experience of Naked and Afraid alone.
Mm.
And just kind of like, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically, in terms of skills and stuff like that. What was the contrast like with that?
Hmm.
And how has that sort of influenced you in terms of community building?
Hmm. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, naked with XL with, 11 other people, it was the best of times and the worst of times. Other people, what's the quote? Other people are either, heaven or hell. It
Right.
really
Yeah.
very, very true. And
Yeah.
so I made some friends, Laura Zara, Eva Rupert, that were like lifetime friends, like just
Hmm.
amazing people that I really clicked with, and we were on the same level. We had that shared reality, so it was
Yeah.
easy for us to
Yeah.
connect. And then there were people there that it was really hard, and asterisk, grain of salt. We were all starving and
Sure.
we had cameras in our faces,
Sure.
and like
Right.
we are
Yes.
not the best versions of
Yes.
ourselves.
Right.
And we all come from different subcultures. Like
Yeah.
I'm more hippie minded, so I'm gonna
Sure.
want to talk it out, and this person's ex-military conservative, so I'm like, okay, they're gonna be in a different way, and neither is right or wrong, right? There's
Sure.
once again those same basic human needs that we have with different strategies for getting those needs met. So it was really, really hard, and that
Hmm.
was so not a fan of that conflict that
Yeah.
came up. And for the most part, even with us starving, we did a great job of talking about it and just being human and just like, hey, I'm pissed at you. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And then of course TV makes it seem, we literally had, 4,000 hours of footage.
Right.
And the 1 hour where we're slightly at each other's throats,
It's
on day 38 or whatever, they're gonna play it to be a whole episode. And it's
right.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
dang it. So they're really focusing on
Yeah.
that. So, shifting from 11 other people to all by myself in South Africa, hunting for 21 days, that was relieving in a way
Mm,
because um, I didn't have to worry about anyone besides myself.
totally.
And the curse that comes with that is I didn't have to worry about anyone besides myself.
Yeah.
And so all of those scapegoats that are easy to blame or circumstances or whatever, this innate human thing that we say, oh, you're the reason, right? Your
Mm, mm,
scapegoatism is very prominent in apes and humans,
mm,
especially. Um, all of a sudden, there was no one to blame but myself. And so all those fingers pointed back at me. And not to get in the whole thing, but like that, those 21 days were the most spiritual 21 days I've ever experienced in my life, like hands down. Fasting and hunting. They let me bring, a handcrafted bow that I built myself, and like so much, like to be in Africa, to be in South
yeah.
Africa that I've
Yeah.
read about, and I'm in the Kalahari and I'm
Yeah.
reading all the
Amazing.
tracks and I'm
Yeah.
using all the skills I've
Yeah.
taught. I'm praying, to my ancestors and like starving, like not praying because I want to kill an animal, look cool on Instagram, but
Right. Because you
because
need
I'm
to.
fucking
Yeah.
starving.
Yeah.
That's a real prayer.
Hmm.
And so that was so spiritual, so revealing to see all my patterns and what I would normally put outward on someone else. All of a
Mm,
sudden, it's back on
mm,
me, kind of
mm,
like a taste
hmm.
of my own medicine.
Mm, hmm.
And that was really hard and shame inducing and scary and all the things. In my program, I got like a 3 hour story about that whole
Mm,
experience, and
mm.
it's really profound.
Yeah. That's awesome.
But yeah, so it was, but then I remember, so after finally hunting for a long time, and then finally killing an impala, this one impala that been connecting with in the spirit realm and all these like
Mm,
crazy kind of, what you read about kind of
hmm.
stories,
Hmm.
it finally happened. And then I'm like, oh my God, I did it. Like I have food I can eat. I'm, eating food and I'm so happy. And then I get about an hour past being totally euphoric. And then I was just so sad because I
Mm.
was by myself.
Right.
And I was just like, I just want my family here. I just
Yeah.
want to feed my village. Like I want like I'm the loneliest king there ever was,
Mm,
you know? And I just
mm,
remember like it's like it still breaks my heart thinking about it.
mm,
'Cause I was
mm-hmm.
like wanting to celebrate with my people, wanting to have, you know, to feed other people and share it and
Yeah.
share this moment. And I had no one. And it was just like, ugh, I just like took it out of me.
Mm,
Um, and that's when I really like it really hit me in a deeper somatic kind of way how much we're built for community. That even if we achieve our greatest goals, right? Like I made my own bow and I went to a new landscape and I struggled and I learned how, I know I shot an impala through the heart, like everything I could have wished for in this like, you know, more masculine military minded
sure.
way. And
Yeah.
I'm just empty inside without
Yeah.
community, you know, like
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. It's like at the end of Into the Wild, you know, unless it's shared, it's just whatever, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So that was profound for me.
Mm, yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Now I'm just deep in thought. There was one
Yeah,
thing, there
yeah.
was
Okay.
a
Be in thought.
yeah. Um, yeah, I'm really curious. It's interesting too. I've never really thought about the scope of sadness with not being able to like share what you have to offer in a sense. Like usually when I think about um community and survival, I think about like receiving the gifts of a community and how that is like the adaptation of like, if I'm suffering, I've got a community that can help me provide. But I haven't ever thought about the inversion of that you're describing, which is like not
Mhm.
having anybody to share your stuff with.
Totally.
And how bizarre that must feel in that context. Because how often are we ever really that alone in today's world with that thing to share? I mean, maybe some people, and maybe we all are. Maybe we're maybe that's a part of it that we're not noticing is how much, I mean, and I guess it's true, like I think about this with jobs. It's like, um, I read somewhere once, I don't remember what, but somebody was just saying like, there's this sort of desperation with most people in terms of their job because it's not really feeding them. They're not like doing what they love to give back, right? And I think about that a lot in terms of how lucky I am in a lot of ways to be able to make a living doing what I love and offering that and not be stuck doing something that I fucking hate. That's
Mm-hmm.
not to say that there aren't things I fucking hate that I have to do for this job.
Totally.
But that like overall, I've sort of built a niche where I can make a living from educating people around rewilding and how much I remember being in other jobs where I wasn't sharing the gifts I felt I had.
Mm-hmm.
Making coffee as a barista was not my passion. There are really good baristas out there, who have a lot to
Uh-huh.
offer
Yep,
in terms
yep.
of the way they make and prepare coffee and love it. That was not my thing.
Totally.
And so, yeah, I just think about how many people work in kind of that situation where, that sadness of not being able to make a living or provide to others with the talents and gifts that you have. Yeah, that's super interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. And yeah, I think there is I say, you know, I work with trauma and people are like, oh, well, I haven't had any crazy traumatic thing. And I'm like, yeah, if you live in this world, I promise you have some trauma. And it's defining what trauma means, not necessarily what has happened to you, but also what has not happened to you. So you
Sure.
weren't welcomed into the village with the whole village singing to you as you were born, kind of
Right.
deep belonging, you know? And so I think there is this trauma or this grief, you could say, that I see in people of what does it matter if I'm here or not? What am I? A basic human need to contribute in a
Totally.
deep, profound way that also plays our gifts. And I think that's one of the biggest robberies of our modern day world is not helping kids and adults find that inner compass of what brings you alive.
Right.
Because if I get into like naturopathy or vitalism, that vital force that heals us, that keeps us moving, our survival mechanism, our willpower is actually connected to feeling alive in everyday life.
Yeah.
And so when you teach a little kid to be like, what do you want to do? And they're like, I want to make a bow. Like, cool, let's follow that, you know?
Yeah.
And now I work with adults who have lost that connection.
Hmm.
I'm like, hey, what do you want to do in the woods? And they're like, I have no idea. Right. They
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
no sense of what brings them alive. And from that comes this loss of physical health and vitality. And then also just a sadness and a grief of like, what does it matter if I'm alive or not? What does it the world keeps going
Right.
and you know, and so it's just like, ugh, it's just like so heartbreaking. Um, but also so beautiful when people do find it.
Mm.
Like the grief feeds the joy and the joy feeds the grief. And so there's this big grief in our world when they come to my program, you know, or deeper
Hmm.
memory, they do find it for the first time in a long time. Man, is it magical to watch
Yeah.
someone come
Yeah.
alive, you know, be
Yeah.
excited to share something. So
Yeah. It's so cool.
yeah, fun stuff. Just go play. Just everyone go, just
Yeah.
follow what you want to do and go play. And I promise it'll work out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's interesting too because I feel like there's this challenge that we face um as schools of rewilding skills in that there isn't really an economy, if you will,
Mhm.
of rewilding. You know, I mean there's avenues people could go to try to find, but like at the end of the day, you know, so many people are economically trapped in particular situations where they're not allowed to offer these gifts in particular ways. And in order to do something like that,
Mhm.
you know, uh, there has to be an economic basis for it, or like, you know, people pay for our classes, for example, or
Mhm.
and if they're economically limited, it makes it challenging. And we can offer scholarships and we can do whatever to try to help it, but there's still people who just cannot take time away or any of that stuff. Um, and I'm just fascinated by this is sort of you know, a question that neither of us will be able to answer, but
Yeah,
just this
yeah.
idea of like, what do people do when they go out of these things, you know, and like,
Mhm.
how do we, as educators, as catalysts of rewilding, like create a kind of like rewilded economic structure? And I mean,
Mhm.
this is actually a similar vein of thinking. A friend of mine once asked me, like, do you think there will ever be like an anarchist, if for lack of a better term, like economic community thing where we just like feed each
Mhm.
other and help each other and we grow our own food or hunt and gather our own food on like a larger scale that's like exists outside of the state economic structure or the one that we're forced into? And I was
Mhm.
like, it already exists. Like it always exists because
Mhm.
that's just like how humans are. We share with each other. You know, it's intrinsic. But the problem is that there's this imposition of this larger system on top of us that's taking all of those things away.
Mhm.
And I just wonder, like, you know, how much, I don't, you know, what is the answer to where people will go? And I try to, in my classes, I don't have like prescription. You know, a lot of people they want like what is the, you know, what are the top 5 ways to start rewilding or whatever, right? Like I just hate that kind
Mhm.
of thing because everybody's so unique. And what we
Mhm.
can do is inspire them and teach them specific skills and things like that. But then how do we you know, catalyze a rewilding economy where people can actually like live it more fully? And
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know if I don't think that is actually possible for the majority of people. But it
Mhm.
is possible for some.
Totally.
And, you know, it is possible to connect to rewilding, even if you're working in a place that doesn't feed you. There are other
Mhm.
ways to get that outside of that.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I have a couple things that come to mind. Definitely not answers, you know, but definitely something to
Yeah.
look into perhaps if
Yeah.
people are interested in it. And, you know, but yeah, it's important to name how to get rid of fucking rugged individualism, how much blessing and privilege I've had in my life, and how, like I said at the start, I've had a lot of amazing mentors as a
Mm.
kid and grew up in a pretty
Same.
stable home, you know, and
Same.
like how fucking lucky I am. And
Yeah.
so if you're
Same.
using this interview right now, person listening, to beat yourself up and say, look at these people, they did it. Fuck that. It was a whole bunch of people
Right.
that have allowed me to get to this place where I'm at
Yeah.
today. And incredibly lucky and
Yeah.
grateful for that. So I'm coming out of a system that, that my dad was a hunter and my dad was not a rewilder at all, but like had enough of something, and my grandpa had enough of something, and all these people came together, and I emerged out of this thing, as a
Hmm.
adaptation, if you
Hmm.
will, of,
Yeah,
of this
yeah.
life. But the other things that come to mind, when I think about people wanting to get into rewilding, kind of the biggest need I see in our culture right now, at least in this country, is a need to be seen. Like
Mm.
we were just talking about, people
Mm.
not being
Hmm.
able to deliver their gifts. And I do one-on-one coaching with my students and do, kind of, counseling or therapy light, if you will. And there's so much need for that
Mm.
because we've all experienced this trauma of being in this world. And so just sitting down, walking with someone in the woods and listening to them and learning how to allow the natural releases and the things that our bodies know how to do, but we have to be skilled enough to get out of the way and allow those to happen. So rewilding as a form of like therapy, in my mind, there's such a huge demand for it right now, and people are starting to wake up in the common culture and say, maybe I should get outside more, right? In my mind, that is rewilding, and it
Totally.
like, and there's you can get a job in it fairly easily, and it's rewarding for me every time I work with someone. It's just like amazing to watch them come back and remember parts of themselves, and to let go of old things and to feel inspired to try a new way. So that's one, is like get into therapy, and that's
Yeah.
basically what rewilding is. Um, and then the other one is like studying like the myths, and that we are stuck in something that is not pure rewilding or anarchy or whatever. And yet there's still, you can get your needs met if you can look at life through a mythical lens or an ancestral, like a big enough lens of like, I am not going to maybe reach my goal of wanting to be a anarchist living in the woods, hunting with my
Sure.
community. But what
Yeah.
can I do in this world right now
Yeah.
that maybe 100 years from now is going to plant the seeds for that? And
Totally.
so getting once
Yeah.
again out of this individual lens and being like, maybe it's rites of passage with kids, maybe it's just teaching my niece or nephew some skills. I always say like I personally am on the 400-year plan. I'm on the plan that I'm never going to
Yes.
see the benefits of,
Yes.
but it gives me great meaning to maybe
Totally.
struggle with paperwork or pay my taxes or all this bullshit that I hate, that I'm like, I have to do this for
Hmm.
my 400-year plan.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
finding the meaning in the bullshit is a really
Totally.
powerful catalyst, if you
I think
will.
that's going to be the quote of this: finding the meaning in the bullshit. Love it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we're meaning
Yeah.
making creatures, and
Hmm.
those stories can be the most powerful things and the most helpful, or the worst fucking things
Yeah.
humans have ever come up
Yeah.
with.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I think of there's so many different sort of metaphors that I have found to give meaning, and I often come back to I forget it and then come back to it. But it's exactly what you're saying. It's passing the torch. Like if I'm not going to be able to have this sort of ideal life that I thought I was going to have when I was 16 and read Ishmael and Daniel Quinn and all the different Tom Brown or whatever,
Totally.
in recognizing the material limitations that I have and in teaching my classes and kind of showing people where are the material limitations and where can they break those down. But how much of it is passing a torch right now for a time beyond our own, you know? And we can still reap the benefits. Like you can still, like you're saying, get the kinds of therapy that allow us to keep going. You know what I mean? I have this thing too where um, it's I suffer with depression. I did a whole podcast on rewilding and depression and working how rewilding can cause depression and how it can
Mhm.
also then alleviate it. And to get out of bed in the morning, there are certain things that I have to do that are sort of like the quick fixes or whatever, right? Like, and I can do those, and that can motivate me and give me purpose and meaning to do and work towards the bigger goals. But
Mhm.
oftentimes people focus on the bigger goals and forget the day-to-day things that they need to just maintain themselves in the world that we live in today, which is
Mhm.
constantly, at war in a real way, with our psychology, with our biology.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think totally hear you on all that and resonate with a lot of it. And the other big one that I guess that's coming to mind is like, you want to rewild, move your body. Like
Hmm.
that is like,
Hmm.
I don't know if you read the Comfort Crisis, if you read
I've
that
heard
book.
of it, but I haven't read it yet. Yeah, it's on
Oh
my
man, I mean,
list.
it's great. It's not going to be
Yeah,
rocket science to you at
sure,
all, but
sure.
it just accumulates all the science. And he's a good storyteller and talks
Mm,
about,
mm.
how comfortable we are. And basically, at the end of the book, he's just like, there's no cure all for health in our modern world except for intense movement. Like he's
Yeah,
like, it's not quite a
yeah,
cure all, but getting in the woods for 4 days out of the month, and like moving your body somewhat intensely, like diabetes, it doesn't go away, but it goes down,
sure.
and
Yeah.
this goes down and this goes down, and chance for cancer. And so it's like, if you have to, I hate this fucking term, but if you have to hack the system, biohack it or
Right.
whatever,
Yeah.
which I hate that,
I'd
but
same.
you're right.
Yeah.
We have to do little things sometimes to
Yeah.
get to the bigger goals. And I
Exactly.
think the biggest one that's helped me, as a person who also has been depressed in this modern world,
Yeah.
is movement
Yeah.
and just like dancing, treadmill, whatever. Just like we're, pretend a mammoth is chasing you, and you gotta run.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's funny you say that. I've been getting a lot more into movement over the last couple of years, and even just today, I was Googling about exercise pre and post COVID, and how it's showing that people who exercise more have fewer and a lesser duration of COVID and long COVID in particular. So,
Mhm.
and if you move more outside of that, because I've been running, I was never a runner. I have
Yeah.
a deformed chest called pectus excavatum, where it's basically like an inverted sternum.
Oh, dang.
And it
Sounds
basically
gnarly.
can, you what?
It sounds gnarly.
It's not, mine isn't as severe as other people's. Like there's definitely, I have a friend who can like eat a bowl of cereal out of his chest because it's so deep. Mine, I could probably get some salsa in there and make like a, chips and salsa, not a full bowl of cereal. But so there's levels, there's degrees of it, but it also can visually look certain ways, and be more severe internally. But it basically squashes my lungs and heart. So during heavy exercise, like my VO2 max will never be what somebody who doesn't have pectus excavatum has. But it's like anything when you grow up and you hear stories and you tell stories, and nobody really told me that this was hindering me physically, even in. But
Mhm.
I never did as good in soccer or any of those things as my peers. And as an adult, I was just kind of like, yeah, I can't really run, I can't swim, I can't do these things because the aerobic activity is like too much. I can't breathe.
Mhm.
Um, and then I don't know what it was, but well, actually, it was going to Boss, doing the hunter gatherer course, and being physically at my prime, essentially, and having it not affect me at all. And one of the things that you have to do at Boulder Outdoor Survival School is run a mile and a half at 7,000 feet elevation the minute you get there.
Whoa.
And so, coming from zero elevation, flying to Utah, taking a shuttle to 7,000 feet, and then having to run a mile and a half. And
Yeah,
there's no time frame. They're not doing, if you don't pass this, you can't go to the class. They just want to see physically how you react to that stress before you go out on the trail.
makes sense.
So I got into running a little bit, and now, after I didn't have anything to do, nothing to train for this year because I didn't go back to Boss this year. But a friend of mine texted and said, "Do you want to do the half marathon?" And I was like, "Fuck yeah!" So I've been training for like
Yeah.
9 months. Um,
Nice.
and I looked up, there's Pectus forums and shit. So I looked on those and was like, how do I do this? And there were people who were like, don't even try. And people who were like, no, it's fine. You just have to go slow, go at your own pace, listen to your body, duh, right? Like, and so, yeah, I'm like a runner now, which is super weird.
Oh yeah,
And
that's
so, yeah, that's,
awesome.
that's why I was Googling running. But what I wanted to say too was, um, in terms of like gifts and giving back, I think one of the things that I've done that I realize is one of my central uh, gifts or talents is bringing people together.
Hmm.
And how oftentimes people they don't really think of that again, like we're, as community building as an ancestral skill or as a primary one. Like the sort of individualism that we were talking about
Hmm.
when I wasn't running just because um, I wanted to start running. I was running because a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to do a thing together, right? So there's like this
Oh,
social component. The other thing it made me think of too was when you were talking about the like the boredom of being alone with nothing to do, no goal, and how I totally think like that too. So like, when I did the 2 day solo at Boss, I was bored out of my fucking mind, and it was just 2 days. I was like, I could never
Yeah.
do alone. I'm losing my mind after 2 days. Um, but yeah, having something to do, or having that, like, there's this interesting combination of like the community building,
Hmm.
doing the thing together. So then now we have a whole like running gang, that's
Hmm.
going to do this half marathon together, and we're already planning like the next one. And
Nice.
oftentimes we don't even run together, but we just like text each other our stats and our running things. That's just a way of like, encouraging one another, you know.
Totally. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I'm just such a social person that all of that stuff is fundamental to me to do anything. So in terms of like, thinking about movement, if you're out there and you're like, I need to do something to help me, and you're thinking about movement, like there's an element of kind of what's the motivational factor going to be, and how can you get more assistance in making those things work? And usually it's culture, right? Like you were saying,
Hmm.
you're the product of all these different people doing these different things and having these habits and all this stuff, and you're the accumulation of that, just like everybody is. So when you're thinking about creating something new or a new habit, it kind of, for me, the foundation is always like, how am I going to do this with people? Because that's how I'm going to end up. That's how I know I'm going to end up doing this, because it's hard for me to do anything by myself.
Totally. Oh my, I mean, if I had a quarter for every time a student was like, it's hard for me to learn plants by myself, I'd have a million quarters. I'm like, dude, you're not supposed to do it alone. Like, there's a reason why it sucks and it's not fun. And like, I'll be, doing something I love. I'll be making a bow or something. And I'm like, this is miserable. I don't want to do this right now. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what am I? What's
Right.
wrong with me? And then my
Yeah.
friend will come over and I'm like, you want to make a bow with me?
Yeah.
It's like so much fun.
Hmm.
Um, and that's like one of my favorite games is coming up with like talking to quote unquote normies or whatever, people in normal culture and being like, what do you love? Like, what makes you come alive? And they're like, oh, I love, fantasy football and working on my car. And I'm like, cool, let's break that down. What do you specifically love
Mm.
about fantasy football or you're working on
Mm.
your car? And they're like, oh, with my car, I like taking it apart and tinkering and understanding
Mm.
and like, and I'm like, cool,
Mm.
and like and finding the like underlying biological
Mm.
rewilding
Hmm.
root of it,
Yeah.
my wife loves, for example, my wife loves jewelry and
Mm.
makeup and adornment, and like there's this like normal culture way we could do that and, use horrible chemicals and see ourselves as ugly without them
Mm.
and all of
Mm.
these like
Mm.
kind of quote
Hmm.
unquote shadow sides to that
Mm.
element. Or we could use that same desire and how do we root it in our place? How do we root it in natural materials? How do we root it in ceremony? How do we root it in community? And then all of a sudden, she's doing like, a girl's rite of passage
Mm.
adornment
Amazing.
ceremony. Like
Yeah.
it's the exact same thing,
Yeah.
right? We
Yeah.
have the same desire, but it's a beautiful way to kind of connect it to a
Mm.
place and connect it to community. And so yeah, so you don't have to throw away what you love in this world, I guess is, what I'm saying.
Totally.
It's
Yeah.
like, how do we adapt it and just make little changes
Yeah.
because the juice is the important thing, the excitement for it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. No, I feel that.
Yeah. But I'm so
So,
happy you're running. That's awesome. I mean,
yeah, it's really weird. Yeah, it's bizarre to be a runner now.
right.
I
Yeah.
don't
I
know.
got into it too. I read Born to Run. And I
Nice.
was
Yeah.
like, okay, I've never been a
Yeah.
runner. I'm gonna do
Yeah.
it. I'm gonna get my minimalist sandals. I ran one marathon, and I was like, okay. And I learned to love it. And then I
Hmm.
was like
Hmm.
listening to myself. I'm like, oh shit, I'm the runner now.
Yep. I know. It's
Oh,
weird.
just wait until you hit mile 12, bro. The endorphins are gonna kick in, bro. I promise it's fun, bro.
All my friends are joking that I'm hitting a midlife crisis. There's like classic midlife crisis white guy, to just like, oh, I'm a runner now. I'm starting to, I go to the gym and I run. And anyway, it's
Totally.
it's it is cliche, but it does make me help
Hey,
feel
there's
better.
yeah, exactly. There's reasons why people do it, and
Yeah.
you're probably going to be happier.
Cool. Well, do you have any questions for me?
Hmm. Yeah, I was curious, curious. to hear a little more. I've heard you talk about or, read your
Mhm.
posts and things like that at times, but like, yeah, what's it like when you mentioned being in more of the city,
Mhm.
and like being a rewilder in the city and like having perhaps the theoretical community who's like into rewilding, but maybe the lack of like some of the resources. Like I'm curious
Totally.
to hear more of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard in a lot of ways. I think there's a like a pressure valve. I think of it as, there's a lot more pressure in the city to be influenced by the cultural narrative of civilization. You're in a completely man-made or civilizational structured and built environment. So everything is heavily controlled, and just in walking in that environment is psychologically different than walking in an environment that is not made by people, or even if it's like a forest that was anthropogenically created by people, it's still a forest. It's still a diverse place, right? It's the opposite from a city, which is usually these days, barren concrete with minimal life around.
Mhm.
Um, and also just the stranger element. You can get away with a lot more in the country just because you're out of the watchful eye of the state. Here there's surveillance, your neighbors are surveilling. I mean, that's true of the country too. Most things in the country, permit and stuff wise, are complaint based. So if you piss off your neighbors, you're that's not a great thing to do. But it's the same in the city, but maybe even escalated to a higher percentage. And Portland's unique. Obviously, we're like a leftist liberal stronghold of the United States. So growing up here was sort of like growing up in the Shire. I leave and I'm just like my mind is blown that you mean the world isn't like this whole thing where everybody
Uh,
believes this particular whatever. Like you get outside of Portland and it's super conservative. Oregon
sure.
was founded as a racist utopia, and they didn't let black people into the state for a really long time.
Well,
So, yeah, a lot of people don't know
I
the race
didn't know
of
that.
Oregon. Yeah, so
Uh,
that's one of the reasons why Portland is super white.
uh,
Not so much anymore, especially outside of the core of Portland, but yeah, so to me, there's sort of this, how do I, this is where Urban Scout, the character Urban Scout that I used to portray, which was, this hunter-gatherer who lived in the city. And it was a very individualistic character. He was by himself, sort of trying to live this way. And when I switched over, I would go around in character. I would pretend that I was actually living this way. People would talk to me. I would interact with them. And this one time, this guy was like, so his mind was blown that this could be real, that there's a fucking guy doing this. This is crazy. And he drove away, and I was just like, I want to make this real. Like, I want to become this character I've created. And I never really did because it's not quite possible, right? I was like, I'm going to do this and I don't know how to do shit. And so for like 2 weeks, I was like, I'm going to be Urban Scout. And I like had this whole master plan where I was like, okay, I'm going to like, I have all these different parks where I could build different shelters around town. And I have different friends with private property who own their houses and I could build shelters in their yards. So I built like a scout pit in one of my friends' backyards. And, I had like a debris hut in another yard and like something else in like a park or whatever. Um, but then how do you acquire food? Again, it's like there's people
yeah.
everywhere. I mean, it was funny because it got to the point where I was like, this would be a lot easier if I had like just a tarp I could carry around, like a shelter, because I'm nomadic, I'm blah, blah, blah. And like, and if I had like, I need like wool clothes or whatever. And like, I need like a water container would be great, like a 5 gallon jug or something, I could fill it up in the to get purified water. Like there's these things in Portland called the Benson bubblers, and it's just like constantly flowing water fountains everywhere. And I'm filling one of those up, and then I'm like acquiring more and more like survival gear or whatever to make this work. And then eventually I'm like, man, I'm like thinking about all this stuff I would need. How could I get this around? I was like, oh, if I had like a shopping cart, I could like steal a shopping cart. And it's basically, I was like, oh, right. Like fucking homeless people have already figured this out. This is just I'm just like a white privileged boy, adult, just like playing homeless LARPing or something. You know what I mean? And I was like, wow,
Totally.
this is insane.
Yeah, that's
Um,
hilarious.
but it came to the point too where even with the notion of this character, it was like realizing that cities are devoid of a lot of life. that there's a lot of people here. There's a social component that you lack oftentimes when you go out. So I've lived out of the city in rural areas, and it's always that the thing I'm missing there is the social component. I go to the cities, and the thing I'm missing is the wildness, right? And the expanse of freedom that comes with that. And so, yeah, it's a hard sort of balance. And we do a lot of things here in town where obviously we're trying to increase the resources here. So permaculture becomes a huge tool in a rewilder's belt, horticulture. And then also networking with project outside of the city. So, Rewild Portland does a thing called the Social Forestry Club, where we've connected with more and more and more landowners who have property that's private that exists outside of the city context, where we can go and have a foraging expedition or a camp out or whatever, and kind of get that sort of therapeutic element of being in the woods, and then be able to go back to the city where our jobs are, or our families, or whatever social networks and things like that, and to try to sort of exist in this balance where we're increasing the biodiversity of the urban context, and still getting some of those benefits of wilderness therapy that you can't get here because it's just a cloistered environment. And so, yeah, I think when I was working on this Urban Scout script, at the very end of it, in one of the later drafts that I never turned into a feature film, but at the end, he basically, there are all these other people who come out of the forest, and you realize that he was actually not alone, that there was this whole group of people that were just sort of invisible the whole time, and he was the scout, which is why his name was Urban Scout. Essentially like a scout for this group of people. And that was towards the end of the project. Obviously, I never turned it into a feature film, but there is a short film out there that is now hidden from view on YouTube, because I'm sure today's world would not like some of the comedy in it.
Yeah.
Not quite appropriate for today's audiences. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Maybe I can get a private link to that sometime.
yeah, we'll see. maybe a private viewing in person.
There we go. But there's that theme again, right? Of doing it with others,
right. Exactly.
If we can simply find community, the struggle won't be so bad, right? Like that's really what it is.
Totally.
And that's what so much psychology has shown us, that you could be in wartime, you can be in the worst possible conditions. And if you're with other people and you have found some sort of meaning making of what is happening or why to keep going, then it really is like you can do so much more. And so I hope that, anyone out there who just feels so lost in this world, I get it. And I guarantee you there's other people in the world also feeling that too. So finding ways to connect and finding ways to have shared reality with people seems to be like the biggest survival skill that I could teach, because world's hard. We're barely surviving. So.
Awesome. Well, I feel like that just sort of summed up all of the parts in a very nice way, as sort of an outro. Nice work.
Thanks. Unintentional.
There is like a side tangent that I did think of earlier when you were talking, and I wanted to just kind of throw out there really quick, because it relates to two different things that we were talking about. One is you're talking about things being relational, right? And how important that is, on the one hand from survival skills. One thing that comes to my mind is like the experience or thought that a lot of people have now, that you can just like go on YouTube and learn things rather than learn them from someone else. And I'm curious if you, as somebody who does in-person classes, what do you see as the differences to kind of inspire people out there, the people out there who are thinking, I could just learn this on YouTube? What's the difference between, learning something in a relational context in the real world with a person versus trying to surf through all of the garbage on YouTube to find valuable stuff?
Totally. The word that comes to me right off the bat is like lineage, just like this, like we were talking about, like if we can zoom out and get out of our individualistic self, then it gives more meaning to this greater struggle. And if we can connect to a lineage of a teacher or a place or an organism that gives its resources to us, then all of a sudden there's like infinite pathways that open up of connection. And in those pathways, that we feel in our body. So like let's say, I just order pine needles offline and I make pine needle baskets in my room. Okay, there's some connection there potentially, right? Well, if I go with an elder or a teacher and I go and I smell the pine needles and I touch the tree and I talk to the tree and I remember that one tree that had a funny knot in it. And then I remember, and all of a sudden it goes from this concrete landscape, like you were describing Portland, of like not much
Mm-hmm.
life to this infinitely diverse surface area that can grow connections and resources. And when I talk and teach about finding resource, finding okayness, finding a settled nervous system, it's almost always those infinite little things that the smell of the tree, the smell of the sap,
Mm.
the sky color that day, the bird. Oh, and we went over here when we were
Mm.
harvesting pine needles and we found a dead animal and then we were curious what killed that animal, right? There's like infinite
Mm.
connections that sprawl out and help us realize how interconnected we are. And without that, without a teacher, without the stories, without the reciprocity, without all of that, it's just us doing arts and crafts. Like it's just another for me, it feels like another hobby to fill the time of this like frantic waiting to die.
Mm. Mm. God, yeah,
To
right.
borrow from one of my
Right.
favorite poems.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, that's not it.
Mm. Mm.
I personally love it so much more when I can feel the threads of all life and I can
Mm.
start tugging on them. And one
Yeah.
skill is enough to get you to all those threads if you're with a
Mm.
skilled enough teacher.
Mm.
And I've been with teachers, I've learned from teachers that way that can tug on this. I'm like, I just want to learn fire. And they're like, well, go find this plant. And I'm like, I don't want to learn plants. And they're like, well, you gotta. I'm like, damn it.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, I can't find the plant. Oh, well, it's on this side of the
Mm.
mountain. Oh, okay. I have to learn like directions and I have to learn the animal
Mm.
sign. And I have to,
Mm.
all of a sudden, I'm part of it all. I'm
Mm-hmm.
playing this one little character in this bigger scheme.
Yeah.
And so I guess it'd be like, I don't know, the difference between like Tetris versus like these like full video games that are a
Mm.
whole
Mm.
world.
Mm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
that's what it feels like the
Yeah.
difference between
Yeah.
learning on YouTube and learning with this beautiful world that we live
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a good
Is there
question.
anything else you'd like to say before we wrap it up?
Thanks for the work you do.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it was as when I was in Utah and I was, starting to dive into this alternate world. Yeah, your words and your posts and just your presence
Mm.
online and your, it wasn't what you were saying, but the wrestling
Mm.
of
Mm.
it and your honesty and yeah, just you were one of those voices that helped me understand the bigger picture
Mm.
and helped me remember things like reciprocity and
Mm.
all these so I guess I just wanted to like say thanks
Yeah.
and we talked about the impact at the very start, and like the impact of one person and like
Mm.
you've impacted me
Oh,
and
thank you.
that hundreds and thousands of people. So yeah, we're not as disconnected as we might feel, and just want to say thanks, and hopefully you can feel some of that
Awesome.
connection here in
Yeah.
North Carolina. So
Yeah. Well, thank you as well. Your work has impacted me as well. So it is now mutual.
beautiful.
Uh, Thanks for coming on the show. And I would really love to continue picking your brain about lots more things, but we'll have to have you back on some other time.
Please,
Uh,
please, I've had a blast. This has been great. I
yeah.
really love talking with you, and yeah, it's been fun.
Cool. All right. Take care.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding and want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thank you for listening.